The morning air in Miami was sticky and thick, pressing against my skin, as if it could weigh down my thoughts. I had just returned from my usual sunrise walk along the bay, the water glinting silver under the early light, when I spotted the envelope in my mailbox. At first glance, it looked ordinary, almost unremarkable, except for the official seal stamped on the front, Miami Civil Court. My hand trembled slightly as I slid it out and turned it over, half expecting some routine notice related to my former cases or a community event. But the moment my eyes fell on the printed title, a cold rush of dread seized me. Eleanor Whitmore, respondent. And just below, in bold, unmistakable letters, Celine Whitmore, plaintiff. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. Celine, my daughter. The girl I had nurtured, guided, and loved unconditionally. The child I had once held close, cradling her when she was sick, wiping away tears when her first heartbreak had broken her small heart. And now she was the one suing me. I tore open the envelope with hands that felt both too small and too clumsy to grasp the weight of reality. The documents inside were thick, official, and meticulous, almost too meticulous. Every accusation was spelled out with a precision that left no room for ambiguity. Claims of mental incompetence, familial abuse, and incapacity to manage my own affairs. I read line after line my morning coffee, cooling on the counter untouched. My eyes flicked to each section, each paragraph, and I felt the world shift beneath me. A part of my mind whispered incredulously, could this be a mistake? I scanned the signatures and dates, and that whisper faltered. Something was off. The signature on one of the attached affidavits bore an unusual flourish, too carefully penned. A memory flickered unbidden years ago. I had noticed irregularities in some of Celine's paperwork while helping her with legal forms, dismissing them at the time as youthful carelessness. Now those past lapses felt deliberate. Celine had a history, a pattern, a way of bending rules to suit her own ends. And she had brought that same pattern here into my home, into my life. I sank into the kitchen chair, my mind reeling. I had faced deceit, manipulation, and fraud in courtrooms across Miami for decades, but never had I imagined the source could be my own child. The thought clawed at me, a bitter mixture of disbelief and betrayal. How had I been so blind? How had the little girl who clutched my hand while learning to ride her bike become someone capable of orchestrating something? This calculated. The phone rang, snapping me from my spiraling thoughts. It was my assistant Marissa calling to check on me. Eleanor, are you all right? You sound shaken, she said. Her voice carried genuine concern, the kind that reminded me of the support I had cultivated over years of professional service. I forced myself to breathe and explained in measured tones that I had received troubling documents and would need her assistance reviewing them. I watched the Miami sun climb higher, its rays slanting through the blinds, illuminating the room with a deceptively calm light. Yet the storm inside me raged on. The daughter I had raised to value honesty and family loyalty had crossed a line I never imagined existed. This was more than a legal challenge, it was a personal betrayal of the deepest sort. I gathered the papers, stacking them with methodical precision, a quiet resolve beginning to replace the shock. I would need to trace every claim, verify every document, and prepare for the battle I had never wanted but could no longer avoid. Celine had underestimated one thing. The woman she thought she could manipulate was not only seasoned in the law, but she was also unbroken in spirit. As I set the last folder on my desk, the morning light casting long shadows across the room, I felt the first stirrings of determination. This was not merely about preserving an inheritance. It was about reclaiming the truth, defending my integrity, and confronting the reality of a daughter who had chosen betrayal over love. I rose from the chair, steadying myself, and walked toward my study where the quiet hum of my old law books and files seemed to whisper strategies Only I could discern. The fight had begun, and I knew the path ahead would demand every ounce of skill, experience, and courage I possessed. And with that, I opened the first file, ready to uncover the depths of Celine's deception, unaware that the discoveries ahead would shake not only my family, but the very foundations of trust I had built over a lifetime. Sitting at my desk that afternoon, the lawsuit still spread out before me, I found my mind drifting to years long past. I could almost hear the laughter of a small girl echoing through the sunlit rooms of our home in Coral Gables. Celine had always been clever, fiercely determined, even as a child, and I had been proud of every accomplishment, every first step, every recital where her voice soared above the other children's. I had believed that such brilliance paired with her warmth was unshakable proof of her character. I remembered her 7th birthday, the cake shaped like a book of fairy tales, the way her eyes lit up when she saw the golden ribbon I had tied around it. She had hugged me so tightly, murmuring secrets into my ear about imaginary adventures, and I had laughed, thinking nothing could ever touch that innocence. I thought of the afternoons we spent in the garden planting marigolds together, her small hands smeared with soil, insisting on doing everything herself, yet seeking my approval at the slightest glance. Even during adolescence, when the world began to test her patience and judgment, I had been convinced her heart would guide her rightly. Celine had always known how to persuade gently sometimes, with tears, sometimes with laughter, but I had seen it as passion, as spirit. I had never paused to wonder whether it could be harnessed for manipulation instead of care. The memory of her high school graduation crept in. She had walked across the stage with a confidence that drew every eye, and when she waved at me, I had felt my chest swell with pride. She had always had that ability to make those around her feel important, special, and above all, trusted. But now, with the lawsuit burning a hole in my reality, that same gift felt twisted, weaponized against me. I forced myself back to the present. It was astonishing, almost unbearable to reconcile the child I had nurtured with the woman who had filed these claims. The Celine I remembered had once asked for my help with homework, for guidance in friendships, for advice about minor heartbreaks that seemed monumental at the time. I had been her constant, her unwavering supporter, and yet now she wielded those same lessons and that same intimacy as a tool to undermine me. Even the subtle manipulations I had noticed over the years now took on a darker shade. The questions about my finances, once dismissed as curiosity or concern, now looked strategic. The gentle nudges to sign forms or write letters, the persistent requests for access to information, they were no longer innocent gestures. They were steps in a deliberate design I had overlooked. The realization gnawed at me. I had allowed love and pride to blind me, to let subtle warnings slip past, believing in the goodness of a daughter who had learned early how to conceal ambition behind charm. Yet even with the weight of betrayal pressing down, I felt a flicker of determination. I had spent decades in the courtroom recognizing deceit, dissecting arguments, and observing the smallest details to uncover the truth. That skill once applied only to strangers, and cases would now serve me in the most personal of arenas. The same eyes that had seen through fabricated testimonies and false affidavits would not be fooled by the familiar smile of my own child. I lingered over these memories a little longer, not out of nostalgia, but to understand the woman Celine had become, and to prepare myself for the confrontation ahead. Every laugh, every hug, every carefully guided decision I had once cherished now served as both a reminder of my love and a lesson in vigilance. Rising from my chair, I collected the documents from the morning's mail, aligning them in neat stacks, and felt a strange calm settle over me. The memories of trust so intimately entwined with the sense of betrayal would fuel my resolve. I knew that before confronting Celine again, I would need to trace every claim, every omission, and every lie to its source. With a deep breath, I turned toward my study, the soft hum of the ceiling fan above, blending with the distant sounds of the city outside. The investigation had to begin, and I could no longer linger in the past. I spent the afternoon at my desk sifting through stacks of old receipts, bank statements, and letters. Each one reminded me of the countless times I had extended my trust to Celine. Loans for her education money to cover a business idea that never flourished, gifts for holidays and birthdays. Every gesture had been given freely, with a sense of maternal pride. I had always believed that a daughter who had been nurtured and guided would never betray that love. But as I looked closer, subtle irregularities began to emerge. Receipts that had once balanced now seemed to vanish into thin air. Figures in my ledger didn't quite match the amounts I remembered giving. And then there were the letters from Celine herself, the ones that at first seemed ordinary, encouraging notes or casual inquiries. Now I reread them with a wary eye. Phrases that once seemed affectionate, questions about my well-being, my investments, my plans for the future now felt pointed, almost probing, like tests rather than expressions of concern. I paused over a particular note she had sent last year, a casual email about an upcoming family gathering. She had written almost casually about my estate planning and long-term financial stability. I had dismissed it at the time as her curiosity or politeness, but now it carried a weight I hadn't noticed before. Why was she so insistent on knowing the details of my finances? Why did she ask repeatedly about properties I had never intended to discuss? My heart ached as I realized the pattern. Over the years, I had given her access not just to money, but to information, trusting her to respect it. Each question, each request for advice had seemed innocent, grounded in love and concern. But the more I examined the records, the more it became clear that Celine had always had an eye on more than just familial closeness. Her curiosity about my assets had been consistent, persistent, and meticulous. The thought settled heavily in my chest. Perhaps those small, seemingly innocent requests were not about care at all. Perhaps they were the first steps in a plan I had been blind to. My mind replayed moments I had long considered harmless. Her eagerness to accompany me to meetings, her constant presence whenever I handled financial documents, her subtle questioning about my will. Each instance now seemed tinged with a purpose I had refused to see. I felt a swell of conflicting emotions. The daughter I loved, the child I had raised with patience and devotion, had become a source of fear and suspicion. I remembered her bright smile, her laughter ringing through the house, her hands holding mine, during moments of childhood pain. Could that same daughter be capable of using our shared history against me? The possibility gnawed at my sense of security, yet I could not deny the evidence accumulating before my eyes. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes briefly, and allowed myself a moment to breathe. The love I felt for Celine had not vanished, but it had become complicated, shadowed by doubt. I realized that if I continued to ignore the signs, I could be making the gravest mistake of my life. Trust once broken could allow more than money to be taken. It could allow my dignity, my autonomy, even my peace of mind to be stripped away. Opening my eyes, I gathered the letters and receipts, organizing them into a clear timeline. Every loan, every question, every visit that had seemed benign now had a place in the pattern forming before me. I would need to confront these inconsistencies carefully to trace the path that Celine had laid so subtly over the years. The fight was no longer hypothetical. It was real, and it had already begun. I rose from my chair, the weight of realization pressing on my shoulders, and walked to the window, the Miami sunlight reflecting off the water in the bay. Each ripple seemed to mirror the unease growing inside me. I knew that the next steps I took had to be deliberate, strategic, and precise. The path forward would require every ounce of my experience, every lesson learned during decades in the courtroom, and every instinct I had honed over a lifetime of discerning truth from deception. With the documents in hand and a quiet resolve settling over me, I turned toward my study. It was time to begin uncovering the full scope of Celine's actions and preparing for the confrontation I could no longer avoid. I had spent the morning organizing the documents, lining up every letter, receipt, and note in chronological order, my mind running through each interaction I had ever had with Celine regarding finances or family matters. By the time she arrived that afternoon, I felt a mixture of apprehension and resolve. She walked through the front door with the familiar smile, the same warmth I had once trusted implicitly, and yet there was an edge I could no longer ignore. "Mother," she said, voice sweet, almost rehearsed. "I heard you weren't feeling well. Are you okay?" Her eyes searched mine as if trying to gauge my mood, and I realized immediately that this was no innocent concern. There was a calculated softness, a measured tone designed to disarm. "I've been better," I replied evenly, standing to greet her. I gestured toward the living room, where the sunlight pooled on the carpet, casting long shadows that seemed almost symbolic of the tension between us. "We need to talk about the lawsuit." Celine's smile faltered just for a moment, but she quickly masked it. "Oh, that. It's just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice lilting, eyes wide, with feigned worry. "I only want what's best for you, Mother. You know that, don't you?" I felt a pang of the old maternal instinct, the desire to believe her words. But I forced myself to look past the performance. "A misunderstanding," I repeated. "You've claimed that I am unfit to manage my own affairs, that I am abusive and incompetent. This is not a misunderstanding, Celine. This is a formal legal action." Her expression shifted, a flicker of irritation quickly covered by concern. "I'm just worried about you," she said. "You've seemed so forgetful lately. I thought maybe this would help you get the support you need." She leaned forward slightly, placing a hand over mine, the gesture intimate, almost comforting, and yet the underlying calculation was unmistakable. I pulled my hand back gently, measuring her reaction. Every word she spoke, every gesture was loaded. She had honed the skill of twisting concern into control, of making even accusations appear as acts of care. It was subtle, insidious, and terrifyingly effective. "I'm perfectly capable, Celine," I said firmly, letting the conviction in my voice reinforce my stance. "I am not the person you claim I am, and I will not allow this action to compromise my life or my legacy." Celine's lips pressed together, and for a heartbeat, I thought she might retreat, but instead, she leaned back, eyes narrowing just slightly, as though testing my reaction. "Of course," she said softly. "I didn't mean to upset you. I only want to ensure everything is handled correctly. For the family. For you." Her words were honeyed, but I could see the knife hidden beneath the sweetness. I made a mental note of every inflection, every hesitation, every fleeting shadow of truth behind her performance. This confrontation had confirmed my suspicions. Celine was meticulous, patient, and manipulative, but it had also shown me how careful I needed to be in my own actions. After she left, I sat at my desk and began cataloging every financial transaction, every conversation, every note she had sent. I created a timeline of her inquiries juxtaposed with my responses and noted any discrepancies or unusual patterns. I reached out discreetly to former colleagues and advisors, asking subtle questions to verify what I already suspected. The work was methodical, deliberate, and exhausting, but necessary. For the first time, I fully recognized the scale of what I was dealing with. This was not a temporary lapse in judgment or a passing whim on Celine's part. It was a calculated campaign, and I would need to approach it, as I had approached cases in my courtroom, with evidence strategy and an unwavering commitment to uncovering the truth. I organized the folders, neatly labeling each with dates and categories, and closed my laptop with a deep, steadying breath. The first confrontation had given me clarity. I knew the path forward, and I knew I could not afford to hesitate. With the evening sun casting a warm glow over the Miami skyline, I turned to the calendar on the wall. The next steps would involve careful observation, discreet investigation, and preparation for the inevitable legal battle ahead. The work had begun, and there was no turning back. I spent the morning in my study, the lawsuit documents spread across the mahogany desk, and made a list of contacts I could reach discreetly. Financial advisors I had trusted for decades, colleagues I had known in the courtroom, and a few private investigators who had assisted me on particularly delicate cases. Each call, each email was carefully phrased, seeking information without revealing the full scope of Celine's audacity. The first reply came sooner than I expected. Lydia Torres, a former business partner of Celine's, confirmed something I had suspected but hoped was wrong. Celine, she explained, had approached her years ago with a promising investment plan. Lydia had been impressed at first, but within months realized that Celine had manipulated documents, misrepresented numbers, and ultimately pocketed significant sums. When confronted, Celine had spun the story so convincingly that many involved had doubted their own recollections. The chill that had begun in my chest at the envelope now traveled to my fingertips. I leaned back, allowing the sunlight streaming through the blinds to warm my face, though it did little to calm the storm within. This was no impulsive daughter, no rash misjudgment. This was a carefully cultivated pattern, repeated and refined. Next, I contacted Marcus Caldwell, an attorney I had known for nearly 30 years. Marcus hesitated, at first the name Celine ringing alarm bells for him, as it had for me. He revealed 2 past cases involving Celine's former partners, a man named Robert Chen, whose estate had been quietly redirected after Celine manipulated his legal paperwork, and James Alder, who had been pressured into signing financial documents under the guise of assistance while she subtly undermined his assets. Both cases had skirted full judicial review settlements, reached quietly, leaving her reputation seemingly untarnished. The weight of realization pressed down on me. Celine had not just taken advantage of trust. She had perfected a system, a methodology that relied on charm, patience, and the naivete of those who believed in her goodwill. She had preyed on men who trusted her, exploiting their vulnerabilities for financial gain, and she had done it with a meticulousness that was almost clinical. I felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. This was my own daughter, the girl I had raised to value honesty, respect, and family loyalty. Yet here she was, exhibiting the same behaviors I had spent a lifetime scrutinizing in others. Every charm, every careful word, every calculated request for assistance. These were tools in her arsenal, used without hesitation against those who loved her most. As I documented Lydia and Marcus's accounts, I began building a timeline, piecing together the puzzle of Celine's previous manipulations. Every detail added weight to the image forming in my mind. She was not reckless. She was deliberate. She had learned to observe, to test boundaries, to identify weaknesses, and then exploit them. And now she had turned those skills against me. My emotions fluctuated between grief and determination. The grief came from the betrayal itself, the knowledge that someone I had nurtured could wield deceit as effortlessly as I had once wielded authority in the courtroom. The determination arose from clarity. I had faced clever, manipulative opponents before, and I had won by methodically uncovering truth and presenting it with evidence. Celine was formidable, but she was not invincible. By evening, my study had become a war room of documents, emails, and phone logs, each detail cross-referenced and cataloged. I sipped a cup of coffee, the bitterness grounding me, sharpening my focus. The first layer of deception had been exposed, and I now had a clearer sense of what I was up against. Celine was a professional manipulator, experienced and relentless, but I had something she could never possess: the knowledge to uncover the truth and the authority to hold her accountable. I closed my ledger and leaned back, letting the Miami twilight filter through the blinds. The path ahead was daunting, but it was no longer shrouded in uncertainty. The next steps would require patience, strategy, and careful observation as I prepared to confront not just the lawsuit, but the reality of the daughter I had thought I knew. I spent the next few days in my study, surrounded by stacks of files, legal pads, and a growing number of digital records. Each piece of information I gathered added a thread to the tapestry of Celine's deception. At first, it was subtle discrepancies in her financial requests, minor inconsistencies in her letters, moments I had dismissed as youthful ambition or clumsy curiosity. But as I traced her past actions, a pattern emerged, one that was deliberate, methodical, and chillingly familiar. There were the documents she had forged hidden within legal filings from previous business ventures. They were not crude. They were crafted with care, a precision that indicated both knowledge and intent. Then there were the false claims of incompetence she had leveled against former partners' reports, designed to make others doubt their own decisions, to bend their trust to her will. Each revelation added weight to my understanding. This was not an impulsive or isolated behavior. This was Celine's modus operandi, refined over years, perfected with practice. I began to compile everything meticulously. Every email, every phone call, every encounter that hinted at manipulation was documented. I labeled them, dated them, and cross-referenced each with my financial records and memories. What had once been isolated incidents now connected into a web that traced her steps across time, exposing the extent of her planning. The thrill of discovery mingled with a cold dread, because with every pattern I uncovered, the danger became clearer. Celine was capable, calculated, and she was aiming at me with the same methodical precision she had used before. Some of the entries in my ledger made my hands shake. Minor events like a casual question about a property I owned or a subtle probe into my investment strategy now revealed their true intent. She had always tested boundaries, gauging my responses, identifying where she could push further. The seemingly innocent concern she had shown over the years had been a tool, a way to measure how much she could extract from me without resistance. I realized I had underestimated her. Her charm, her smile, her ability to frame herself as caring and concerned, all of it had been a deliberate strategy. And now, armed with knowledge and experience, I could recognize the signals that had once passed unnoticed. But knowing was only the beginning. Awareness brought no comfort. It only underscored the urgency of the battle I was about to fight. Each night, I returned to my study, poring over files, comparing handwriting, tracing financial movements, and reviewing old communications. I documented her patterns in a binder, a reference for strategy, a shield against future misdirection. The more I learned, the more apparent it became that Celine's campaign had a rhythm, a cycle of inquiry, subtle manipulation, and incremental control. Every thread I pulled revealed yet another layer, and with each layer, the stakes grew higher. By the fifth day, I had a full picture emerging. Celine's actions were not random. They were choreographed. Every loan, every question about my will, every moment she positioned herself as a supportive daughter was part of a larger plan. The realization brought a clarity that was both terrifying and empowering. I could anticipate her moves, predict her next steps, and prepare countermeasures. I leaned back in my chair, reviewing the binder one final time that evening. The pattern was clear. Celine was a manipulator of remarkable skill, but she had underestimated her opponent. I had lived decades scrutinizing the subtleties of deceit, exposing hidden motives and untangling webs of lies. This was my domain, and now the battlefield had moved into the most personal arena of all. With the evidence compiled and the strategy forming in my mind, I closed the binder and straightened the papers on my desk. Each discovery had increased the danger, yet each also clarified my next moves. The war was no longer abstract. It was tangible, and it demanded both patience and precision. I turned off the desk lamp, letting the soft Miami twilight spill across the room, and walked to the window to gaze at the skyline. The city hummed with life, indifferent to the struggle unfolding in my home. I knew what needed to be done next: careful observation, discreet confrontation, and the methodical preparation that would carry me into the legal battle that loomed ahead. Sleep had become a stranger. Night after night, I lay awake in my Miami home, staring at the ceiling, tracing invisible patterns in the shadows, replaying every conversation, every interaction with Celine. Her presence, once comforting, now carried a subtle weight that pressed against my mind. It was not merely the lawsuit that unsettled me. It was the way she had begun to manipulate my perception of reality itself. During our last meeting, she had commented casually on moments I barely remembered, phrasing them as if I had forgotten entirely. "Mother," she said softly, "remember last month, when you misplaced the property deeds? You were so upset, but I helped you find them." Her voice was gentle, almost nurturing, yet the assertion planted a seed of doubt. I recalled the deeds perfectly filed safely weeks before, and yet for a fleeting instant, a whisper of uncertainty crept in. Had I really misplaced them? These moments multiplied. Celine would point out little mistakes, minor lapses in conversation, every detail framed to suggest that my memory and judgment were slipping. I began to question myself, struggling to distinguish between genuine forgetfulness and her calculated suggestions. The line between reality and manipulation blurred as the nights grew longer, the city lights outside my window casting distant, indifferent glimmers across my bedroom. I felt isolated. Friends and colleagues tried to offer comfort, but how could they understand the subtlety of Celine's tactics? No legal precedent, no courtroom experience could fully prepare me for the intimate precision of a daughter weaponizing shared trust. I began keeping a nightly journal recording every incident, every phrase, every moment of hesitation or uncertainty. It was exhausting, but necessary, a way to anchor myself in truth. Then, during a particularly restless night, I noticed something. A pattern emerged in her accusations. Events she claimed I had forgotten or mismanaged were often exaggerated, sometimes entirely misrepresented. The property deeds, the small disagreements over dinner plans, the timing of routine appointments, she had carefully bent facts, creating the illusion of incompetence. My heart raced as realization dawned. These shadows of doubt were not random. They were strategic. Understanding her method brought a strange clarity. Each incident I had begun to question, each pang of uncertainty I had felt, had been orchestrated. Celine was testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses, and measuring the strength of my confidence. The pattern was consistent, predictable, and entirely under her control, unless I reclaimed the narrative. I began cataloging these incidents with care, cross-referencing them against my personal records, past communications, and financial documents. For every forgetful claim she had made, I had evidence to contradict it. Every attempt to make me question my judgment became an opportunity to reinforce the truth. Her strategy, however clever, was now visible in the light of meticulous observation. Despite the mounting clarity, the psychological toll was real. I wrestled with insomnia, lingering doubt and the bitter ache of betrayal. I reminded myself constantly that emotional manipulation could feel as disorienting as any legal argument, and that recognition of the pattern was my strongest weapon. Each documented exaggeration, each misrepresentation, became a stone in the foundation I was building for confrontation and defense. By the end of the week, the binder on my desk had grown thick with notes, evidence, and cross-checked timelines. My nights remained restless, but the dread was tempered by preparation. I could see Celine's methods, anticipate her next moves, and begin strategizing my response. The shadows of the mind she tried to cast could no longer obscure the light of my experience and diligence. I closed the binder carefully, the soft click echoing in the quiet of my study. The legal and emotional battle was intensifying, but I now held the first real advantage insight into her methods. The next step would require careful observation and deliberate action, as I prepared to confront not just her claims, but the entire architecture of manipulation she had constructed over years. I waited until evening, the house quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic along Coral Way, before calling Damien into the study. The weight of the documents, the patterns I had uncovered, and the insidious way Celine had been manipulating me demanded that I confide in him. I needed an ally, and he was the one person I could trust, if only he could see the truth. "Damien, sit with me for a moment," I said, motioning to the chair opposite my desk. His expression was polite, but wary. As he eased into the seat, the tension in his shoulders, betraying the unease I knew he felt. "I've been going through everything." I began carefully choosing my words as I would in court. "About Celine. Her questions, her requests, the patterns I've noticed over the years. It's more than curiosity. I believe she's been manipulating not just me, but situations to her advantage. And now, with this lawsuit, it's clear she has a strategy, a deliberate, calculated one." Damien's brow furrowed and he leaned back, crossing his arms. "Mom? That's a serious claim. Are you sure, Celine? She's your daughter. It's hard to imagine she'd do something like that." His voice carried the conflict between loyalty and the need to believe in the woman he had grown up with. "I wouldn't be saying this if I weren't certain," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "I've spent days cataloging her actions, comparing them to documents and correspondence from years ago. There's a consistent pattern, Damien. A method to the way she gathers information, the way she questions me, the way she positions herself as concerned or helpful. This is not accidental." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his dark hair. "I want to believe you, Mom. I really do. But I also love Celine. I married her knowing your character, your wisdom. I thought she did too." His eyes searched mine, a mixture of fear and confusion, as if trying to reconcile two conflicting truths. "I understand, Damien," I said softly. "But love cannot blind us to evidence. What I need from you is clarity and support, not to take sides blindly, but to help see the patterns I've uncovered and verify them. You've seen how she behaves in your own home, how she responds to questions about money or planning. You can help me confirm what I suspect." A long silence followed. He looked down at his hands, and I could sense the internal struggle as he weighed loyalty against reality. Then he nodded slowly, the first sign of alignment with me in this delicate battle. "All right, Mom. I'll pay closer attention. I'll be careful, but I'll watch. I can't ignore this if what you're saying is true." I felt a surge of relief. The emotional stakes were high, and the weight of Celine's manipulations was formidable. With Damien observing, I would have insight into her interactions that I couldn't obtain alone. But even as I felt a spark of hope, I recognized the danger Celine's manipulations extended beyond me. She could twist Damien's loyalty frame observations to her advantage or gaslight him into questioning our shared understanding. Over the next hour, we went over specific incidents, carefully noting discrepancies between Celine's statements and the records I had compiled. Damien's memory and perspective filled in gaps I hadn't noticed, corroborating some suspicions and highlighting other anomalies. The more we compared notes, the clearer it became that the web Selene had spun was vast and intricate, and her skill in presenting herself as concerned and reasonable was impressive. By the time our discussion ended, the room felt heavier, charged with the tension of what we now knew. Damien had agreed to help, but the cost was clear. Family dynamics would shift irreversibly. Celine's influence over him and the lingering affection he felt for her would complicate every observation, every intervention we made. I gathered the notes, placing them carefully in the binder. I had begun assembling, feeling the weight of both strategy and consequence settle over me. With Damien now cautiously at my side, I had an ally, but also a reminder that the battle was no longer mine alone, and that every step forward would require vigilance, precision, and careful management of family bonds. I closed the binder and looked out the window at the fading light over the Miami skyline, already planning the next steps in observation and documentation. The confrontation and careful evidence gathering I had started could now proceed with Damien's insight, but Celine's manipulations were far from over. The morning air in Miami carried an almost tangible tension as I walked into the courthouse. The civil division of the Miami-Dade court was alive with murmurs and footsteps, an undercurrent of anticipation that seemed to press against me with every step. The lawsuit Celine had filed was no longer confined to our home or private correspondence. It was official, public, and every detail of her accusations would be examined under the glare of the courtroom. Media outlets had caught wind of the case almost immediately. Journalists hovered near the courthouse entrance cameras, pointed like watchful eyes, eager for a glimpse of Eleanor Whitmore, the retired judge being accused by her own daughter of incompetence and abuse. I felt their scrutiny as I passed the whispered conjectures, scraping at my composure. Even so, I held my head high. I had spent decades facing adversaries in court who sought to manipulate perception and distort facts. This was no different, except that the stakes were personal. In the preparation room, my attorney Vivienne Cross was already waiting. Her presence was a calm anchor. Vivienne had handled some of the most challenging civil cases in Florida, and she carried an air of authority, tempered with sharp intuition. "Eleanor," she said, reviewing the documents I had brought, "the claims are serious, but they're based on inconsistencies and exaggerations. We have the evidence to dismantle each one. You've documented everything meticulously, and that will serve as our backbone in court." I nodded, grateful for her steadiness. "I've cataloged every interaction, every letter, every suspicious request. I know her methods now, Vivienne. This isn't just a personal attack. It's a professional campaign honed over years." She looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a spark of determination. "Exactly. And now we treat it like a case. Timeline witnesses verification of facts. Every subtle manipulation she's used will be countered with proof. We'll show the court the pattern of behavior, the exaggerations and the inconsistencies. You will not be defined by her lies." We spent the next few hours reviewing strategy, outlining how to present evidence, and rehearsing responses to likely questions. The process was meticulous, methodical, and exhausting, but I felt a growing sense of control. I had been manipulated and doubted, but now the battlefield was clear, and I had both the weapons and the strategy to confront it. When the proceedings finally began, the courtroom was almost full. Observers murmured quietly as Celine entered, flanked by her attorney, presenting the same carefully constructed facade of concern I had seen so many times before. She smiled at me, a gesture that once would have melted my heart, now only reinforced the seriousness of her duplicity. The judge, a man I had respected during my career, called the session to order. He acknowledged the presence of the media and emphasized the confidentiality of proceedings regarding specific family matters. Even as the gavel fell, the weight of public scrutiny remained pressing against every argument, every piece of evidence. Vivian leaned in, whispering the final reminders. "Stay calm, Eleanor. Facts first. Truth always prevails when presented clearly. Trust in the work you've done, and trust that the court will see through the smokescreen she's built." I inhaled slowly, letting the words settle. I recalled the long nights cataloging every financial interaction, every misleading statement, and every subtle attempt at manipulation. I recalled Damien's hesitant support and the painstaking construction of evidence against her claims. All of it led to this moment, a convergence of preparation, clarity, and resolve. As the first witness was called and Celine's allegations began to unfold, I felt a strange mixture of tension and focus. The courtroom was no longer abstract. It was the center of a battle I had been preparing for. Every observation, every document, every detail, now taking on new significance. The narrative she had tried to construct in whispers and private insinuations would be tested in full light, piece by piece, under scrutiny and cross-examination. I adjusted the documents on the table in front of me, the edges crisp, the evidence organized, each page a testament to years of careful attention and the clarity that had only grown in the wake of betrayal. The fight was no longer theoretical. It was real unfolding, and every move mattered. With Vivienne at my side and the first witness ready to testify, I leaned back, slightly centering myself. The legal battlefield was fully laid out, and the work we had done would finally be put to the test. The first phase of this confrontation had begun, and there was no turning back. The day after the initial proceedings, Vivienne and I convened in my study, the room heavy with the accumulated weight of files and digital records. The courtroom had been only the opening salvo. Now the real work began, systematically uncovering every piece of evidence that could reveal Celine's true nature. We started with her past, tracing her steps through employment records, financial filings, and legal documents from years before I had even met her. Each file we examined told a consistent story, a trail of minor frauds, misrepresentations, and manipulation, carefully concealed behind a veneer of charm. It was methodical, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. Vivienne spread the documents across the table, her eyes scanning for inconsistencies I had overlooked. "Eleanor, look at this," she said, pointing to a notarized agreement involving Celine and a former partner, a man named Robert Chen. The papers revealed that she had manipulated him into altering his will, shifting the majority of his estate to her benefit. He had been persuaded, subtly, emotionally coaxed, and convinced that he was making the right choice, even as the reality was the opposite. My stomach tightened as I leaned in, reading the details. This was no small scam. Celine had perfected a strategy, charm, trust, incremental influence, and a careful documentation of the actions she wanted to cover later. And it had worked repeatedly. Vivienne flipped to another folder, this one detailing her interactions with a man named James Alder. The pattern was the same. Celine had leveraged emotional influence to gain control over his finances, presenting herself as the concerned confidant while steadily expanding her access and control. The twist of discovering this repeated pattern hit me harder than any accusation she had leveled against me. This was no impulsive act. This was a calculated approach honed over years. The familiarity of the methods, the subtlety of her techniques, mirrored the very tactics I had spent decades detecting in courtrooms filled with professional fraudsters and con artists. And yet, I had never anticipated that the person standing across from me at the dining table, smiling and acting concerned, could be the same strategist. Vivienne looked up at me, eyes sharp and unwavering. She's underestimated you, Eleanor. She's counted on your love and trust to blind you to her methods. That mistake, her first mistake, will be critical. I exhaled slowly, absorbing the confirmation. My experiences as a judge had trained me to recognize manipulation patterns and false narratives. I knew where to look, how to cross-reference claims, and how to separate truth from fabrication. Celine had relied on deception, but she had not accounted for the possibility that her opponent would have both the tools and the patience to unravel her carefully constructed web. Over the next several hours, we documented every incident: letters she had sent, interactions with friends, minor inconsistencies in her accounts, and the manipulations of former partners. Each piece fit into the mosaic. We were building a pattern that, once laid bare, could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Celine's confidence, her calm manipulation, had relied on her belief that no one could see through it. Now, with evidence in hand, that illusion was shattered. As we compiled the timeline and categorized the documents, I felt a sense of purpose that had been absent during the nights of doubt and fear. Each revelation reinforced the reality. Celine had a plan, and that plan relied on obscuring the truth. But every step she had taken left traces, and I had learned to follow those traces relentlessly. I carefully organized the files into a presentation for the court, ensuring that each detail would expose not only her actions, but also the methodical pattern of manipulation. This was not about vengeance. It was about clarity, justice, and truth. Celine had underestimated both my resolve and my experience, and now she would discover that expertise could unravel even the most carefully orchestrated schemes. With the binder finalized and evidence clearly documented, I leaned back and allowed a quiet, determined calm to settle over me. The courtroom would see the story not as Celine had crafted it, but as it truly was: a tale of manipulation laid bare by methodical observation and unwavering diligence. The next step would be to present the evidence in court, each revelation a carefully aimed strike in the confrontation that had been building for months. The courtroom hummed with quiet tension as we prepared for opening statements. I sat beside Vivienne, clutching the binder of meticulously organized evidence, feeling the weight of every moment that had led here. Celine was across the room, her posture poised, her expression calm, radiating the same careful concern she had always used to disarm me. The contrast between our shared history and the present confrontation made my chest tighten. Vivienne leaned close, her voice low and steady. Remember, Eleanor, focus on facts, evidence, and the patterns we've uncovered. Let the court see her facade for what it truly is. When Celine's attorney began, he painted a picture of a concerned daughter, a woman trying to protect her mother from poor judgment, from mistakes that might compromise her family's assets. Celine nodded along, her eyes soft, her expressions measured. Every gesture had been rehearsed, every word carefully chosen. The courtroom, including my own son Damien in the audience, leaned in, compelled by the narrative of maternal concern versus alleged incompetence. Then it was our turn. Vivienne rose and presented the timeline. The letters, the financial records, the documented inconsistencies in Celine's claims. Each point was precise, leaving no room for interpretation or doubt. I followed, reciting the facts I had meticulously recorded over weeks, my voice steady, unwavering. The years I had spent dissecting arguments, exposing manipulation, and verifying evidence coalesced into clarity and purpose in that moment. Celine's expression shifted subtly as the binder's contents were revealed. She tried to maintain composure, but the first cracks appeared. Fleeting twitches, quickened breaths, eyes darting briefly to her attorney. Each cross-referenced document, each verified statement slowly chipped away at the carefully constructed image she had presented. Her facade of concern began to crumble under the weight of factual evidence. Witnesses we had called added depth to the narrative, providing testimony about her past manipulations and highlighting patterns of deceit. Former colleagues, financial advisors, and mutual acquaintances corroborated the timeline we had painstakingly built. Vivienne's questioning was sharp but controlled, systematically exposing contradictions between Celine's statements and documented events. With every exchange, the tension mounted not just for the courtroom audience, but within me as I faced the daughter I had once loved and trusted unconditionally. When Celine was cross-examined, she struggled to maintain the calm demeanor she had cultivated for years. Vivienne's questions were pointed, revealing the gaps between her claims and the facts we had gathered. I watched as the carefully rehearsed narrative faltered her explanations. Vague and inconsistent, her composure increasingly tenuous. The courtroom became a stage for a battle that was both public and intensely personal. Through it all, I reminded myself to remain grounded. This was not vengeance, not anger, not even fear. It was the pursuit of truth and the defense of my own integrity. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation, louder than any tearful plea or calculated concern Celine could present. Every pattern we had documented, every instance of her manipulation, was now visible for the court to assess. By the end of the session, the courtroom had absorbed the juxtaposition of claims and reality. Celine's attempt to mask deception with manufactured concern had been systematically dismantled, each carefully crafted statement met with verification, contradiction, and context. The tension between us was palpable, yet beneath it all, a quiet determination had settled in me, a recognition that truth, when meticulously presented and supported, could prevail even against the most calculated of lies. Vivienne gathered the evidence and sat back beside me, giving a brief, reassuring nod. The strategy had worked as intended, but the case was far from over. There were still layers to unravel, still witnesses to examine, still motions to respond to. The fight was entering a new phase, one that would demand every ounce of patience, observation, and precision we had cultivated. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the courtroom as Vivienne rose to present the evidence we had gathered. I sat rigidly beside her hands, resting on the thick binder that contained years of careful documentation, each page a testament to patience, observation, and meticulous strategy. Across the room, Celine's composed facade remained, but I could see subtle tension in the way she shifted in her chair. Vivienne began systematically. She outlined the financial irregularities, each loan and gift Eleanor had extended to Celine, carefully traced with dates, amounts, and correspondence. She displayed copies of letters, emails, and notarized documents, highlighting inconsistencies and embellishments in Celine's statements. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the revelations settling like dust on the polished wood surfaces. Then came the first dramatic twist. Vivienne introduced evidence of Celine's prior manipulations cases with her former partners, Robert Chen and James Alder. The documents showed how Celine had systematically gained control over their finances, presenting herself as a concerned confidant while subtly steering assets to her benefit. The revelation was precise and unambiguous, leaving little room for doubt. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and fascination. I felt a shiver of vindication. Celine had underestimated me. She assumed that love, familiarity, and subtlety would shield her past from scrutiny. She had counted on me being blind to patterns on her cultivated charm, masking her methods. But the strategy I had employed, meticulous documentation, cross-referencing records tracing her history, was airtight. Every calculated move she had taken now worked against her, exposed in full light. Vivienne then presented the forged documents, highlighting the alterations and the precise moments in time they were introduced. The court's attention sharpened, witnesses leaned forward, and even Celine's attorney seemed momentarily unsettled. Each example of falsification, Each instance of financial deceit was paired with the corresponding factual record, proving a deliberate pattern of manipulation. As we moved through the evidence, the emotional weight pressed on me. I had spent sleepless nights cataloging every nuance of her actions, reconciling betrayal with maternal instinct. Now, seeing it laid bare for others to witness the deliberate exploitation of trust, the false claims, the financial schemes, I felt a cold sense of clarity. This was not just a legal battle. It was the unveiling of a character hidden behind years of performance and pretense. Celine's expression had begun to shift. The calm concern she had perfected for years was cracking under the relentless exposure of her methods. I noted the subtle tightening around her eyes, the faint tremor in her hands, the hesitation in her responses. She had counted on manipulation and charm, but she had misjudged the preparation and experience of the opponent she faced. The courtroom absorbed the unfolding drama. Family members, friends, and court observers could now see the patterns that had been invisible in private interactions. Every document, every corroborated testimony added to the undeniable picture of Celine's manipulative behavior. Damien sat in the audience, his face a mixture of shock and comprehension, realizing the full extent of what I had uncovered. Vivienne concluded the session with a firm summation, emphasizing the consistency of the evidence, the deliberate patterns, and the discrepancies between Celine's claims and documented reality. I felt a surge of resolve. The evidence was no longer abstract. It was tangible, public, and undeniable. The next phase of the battle would hinge on interpretation and judgment, but the groundwork had been laid with precision and clarity. I closed my binder and leaned back slightly, letting a measured calm settle over me. Celine had been exposed, her strategies laid bare, and the courtroom now understood the true nature of her actions. The revelations would echo beyond this trial, but for now the focus remained on the immediate proceedings where each piece of evidence would continue to shape the outcome of a confrontation years in the making. That evening, after the courtroom had emptied and the buzz of the day's revelations lingered, Damien approached me quietly. His expression was tight, his jaw set, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He asked if he could speak with Celine privately, and I agreed, sensing that the confrontation was inevitable. I waited in the study, the binder of evidence still open on the desk, as they spoke in hushed tones down the hallway. Damien's voice carried a firmness I hadn't heard in years, a mixture of disbelief and anger. I could hear Celine trying to explain herself, weaving the same story of concern and love that she had presented in court. But Damien interrupted sharply. "Stop, Celine. Just stop," he said, voice low but resolute. "I've seen the documents, the records, the inconsistencies. I know what you've been doing." There was a pause, a quiet tension that stretched too long. Then Damien returned, his eyes glistening but clear. He sat across from me, and for the first time since the lawsuit began, the full weight of comprehension was visible on his face. "Mom," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't realize... I knew things seemed off sometimes, but I didn't understand the scale. She's been manipulating not just you, but everyone around her. All this time I thought I could trust her. I was wrong." I reached for his hand, gripping it firmly. "Damien, it's not your fault. Deception can be subtle even for the most careful eyes." She counted on familiarity, on the bond of family to conceal her intentions. "What matters now is that you see the truth clearly." He exhaled deeply, leaning back in the chair, running a hand through his hair. "I can't believe I didn't notice sooner. The loans, the questions, the constant need for guidance, it was all manipulation. I've been blind, Mom. I was complicit in my own ignorance." I squeezed his hand again, the connection grounding both of us. Ignorance isn't complicity. Love and trust can blind anyone. What matters now is how we respond. You have the clarity you didn't before, And that gives you a choice to protect yourself and me and to prevent further manipulation. He nodded slowly, swallowing hard. I will, Mom. I'll make sure she doesn't get the chance to hurt you further. I can't undo what's happened, but I can support you now and ensure she doesn't succeed. The emotional intensity of the moment brought a quiet relief, a sense of alignment between us that had been fractured by Celine's manipulations. For years, Damien had relied on love and loyalty to guide his decisions. Now, armed with evidence and understanding, he had chosen clarity over blind allegiance, and in doing so, strengthened the bond between mother and son. We spent the rest of the evening reviewing the timeline of events, the manipulations we had uncovered, and planning the approach for the next steps in court. Damien's insight, his recognition of inconsistencies he had once dismissed, added a crucial layer to our strategy. I felt a renewed sense of purpose and solidarity knowing that we were aligned, vigilant, and prepared for the confrontations yet to come. The night settled quietly over Miami. But in the study, our determination burned steadily. With Damien now fully aware of Celine's true nature, I knew that the next steps, both legal and personal, would be faced together with a clarity and resolve that could no longer be shaken. The courtroom was silent as Vivienne delivered our closing argument. Her voice was calm, authoritative, and precise, summarizing months of evidence into a clear, undeniable narrative. Every document, every testimony, every subtle manipulation Celine had attempted was recounted in a manner that left no room for doubt. I listened carefully, feeling the weight of her words anchor the truth firmly in the minds of the judge and those present. Celine's attorney had presented his own closing, emphasizing concern and a supposed need for protection. Celine sat beside him, her expression carefully composed, projecting the same image of dutiful care she had cultivated for years. I could see, however, the subtle tension in her hands, the tight grip on her folder, the slight narrowing of her eyes. She was aware that the evidence we had meticulously gathered was a threat she had underestimated. Next came the expert testimony. Dr. Lillian Harris, a neuropsychologist, spoke with clarity and authority about my mental acuity. She presented the results of rigorous cognitive tests, demonstrating that my memory, reasoning, and judgment were fully intact, well above average for my age. Each statement reinforced the work Vivienne had done to dismantle Celine's claims, making clear that her allegations were unfounded and strategically exaggerated. I felt a calm settling over me, but the tension remained taut. Celine's credibility was being questioned in ways that could not be easily countered. The judge's eyes shifted from the notes in front of him to the witnesses back to me as he absorbed the layers of evidence. I knew that the courtroom had witnessed a thorough dismantling of her claims, but the final verdict still hung in the balance. Vivienne's gaze met mine briefly, a subtle nod that conveyed both reassurance and determination. We had presented the facts, revealed the pattern of manipulation, and documented Celine's history. Now it was a matter of whether the law would recognize the truth as clearly as we did. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the judge began his final statements. He recounted the evidence, the expert testimony, and the inconsistencies in Celine's claims. His voice was deliberate, careful, measured, and each word carried the weight of authority. He addressed the allegations of incompetence, the financial manipulations, and the documented history of deceit, confirming that the court had examined everything thoroughly. Finally, he leaned forward slightly and pronounced the decision my competence was affirmed. The court found no evidence to support Celine's claims of mental incapacity or abuse. The allegations were not only dismissed, but had been substantiated as manipulative, strategically false, and designed to mislead both family and legal authorities. A wave of relief washed over me, tempered by exhaustion. Months of careful documentation investigation and emotional resilience had culminated in this moment. The courtroom, once a space of tension and uncertainty, now resonated with clarity and justice. I closed my eyes briefly, savoring the quiet vindication. Celine's attempts at manipulation had failed, her strategy unraveled by careful observation, meticulous evidence, and unwavering resolve. The weight of betrayal remained, but so did the validation of my truth, and the certainty that the next steps could be faced with both clarity and confidence. The gavel fell, and the words echoed through the courtroom. The lawsuit was dismissed. My mental competence affirmed, Celine's claims rejected entirely. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, a release I hadn't realized I had been holding for months. Every detail, every piece of evidence meticulously gathered had culminated in this moment of validation. Vivienne turned to me with a small, satisfied smile. "You did it, Eleanor." The truth prevailed. I nodded, feeling the weight of anxiety and doubt lift from my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without the gnawing tension that had accompanied every interaction, every document, every whispered doubt. Celine sat across the room, her face a mixture of defiance and exposure. The evidence we had presented, coupled with the testimony confirming my mental clarity, had publicly revealed her manipulations and deceit. I watched as the court absorbed the reality of her actions, a carefully orchestrated pattern of lies, financial exploitation, and emotional manipulation, laid bare for all to see. Even as the legal battle concluded, the potential consequences for Celine loomed. The court had flagged evidence suggesting fraudulent activity, and the possibility of criminal investigation was now very real. It was not my intention to destroy her life, but the truth carried weight beyond the courtroom, and she would have to answer for the patterns of manipulation she had executed over years. I felt a quiet sense of triumph, but also a profound release. Months of sleepless nights, subtle betrayals, and moments of uncertainty had given way to clarity. My dignity, once threatened by false accusations and a daughter's betrayal, was restored. I could trust my judgment again, and the confidence that had been undermined by manipulation returned steadily. Damien approached me, eyes bright, but still holding the residue of the shock he had endured. "Mom, you did it. You held your ground." I smiled at him, grateful for his presence, his support, and his understanding. Together, we had confronted the deception and emerged stronger. As the courtroom emptied, I gathered the binder, my hands steady, my mind clear. The fight had been personal, legal, and emotional, but it had ended in truth. The next phase would be rebuilding, strengthening the bonds that had been tested, and reclaiming the peace and security that had been momentarily threatened. With the finality of the decision behind me, I stepped into the hallway, the sunlight spilling in from the windows, and felt the first genuine sense of relief in months. The battle was over, and I could finally begin to rebuild both trust and life. I spent the morning on my terrace, sunlight warming my face, a cup of coffee in hand, and the distant hum of Miami life below. For the first time in months, I felt the quiet satisfaction of being fully in control of my life again. The courtroom battles, the doubts, and the betrayals had left scars, but they had also left lessons in vigilance, self-respect, and the importance of carefully choosing whom to trust. The first of these lessons was clarity. I had learned that love and familiarity, while powerful, could be exploited if not paired with awareness. Celine's deception had been thorough, but I had discovered a strength within myself I had not realized I still possessed. The experience reminded me that self-respect was as essential as compassion, and that one could not compromise one's own dignity for the sake of blind trust. I began planning small projects that had been postponed during the legal turmoil. I reached out to friends I had neglected, inviting them to lunch, reconnecting with the people who had always offered genuine support. I reorganized my study, placing the carefully documented binders into storage, a tangible reminder of lessons learned and battles fought. At the same time, I enrolled in a local continuing education class, something I had always wanted to do, but never prioritized. Damien visited frequently, helping with household tasks, sharing news, and joining in the quiet enjoyment of routine after chaos. The bond between us had deepened through shared vigilance and confrontation, and we now moved forward with a stronger connection built not only on love, but on mutual understanding and respect. I also spent time reflecting on forgiveness, not of Celine, not yet, but of the naivety that had allowed her actions to succeed for so long. Understanding patterns, recognizing manipulation, and embracing personal growth became my focus. Each day I felt stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the rhythms of my own judgment and intuition. By the end of the week, my home felt like a sanctuary once more. I walked through the rooms, noting the restored order, the small signs of life I had allowed to flourish again. Each moment, from tending the garden to reading in the sunlight, reinforced a sense of peace I had thought was lost. I settled in my favorite chair, the Miami skyline glowing in the late afternoon, and let a calm sense of renewal wash over me. I had regained control of my life, reclaimed my confidence, and strengthened my bonds with those I truly trusted. The past had tested me, but I was ready to move forward stronger, wiser, and fully aware of the value of respect and vigilance. Weeks later, the weight of Celine's manipulations had fully lifted. News of her legal consequences spread quietly through our circle fraud charges, potential prison time, and restitution in motion. I felt a measure of relief, not revenge, knowing that justice would follow its course. Her choices had consequences, and the court had ensured that truth prevailed. I found myself thriving personally and socially. Lunches with friends, long walks along the bay, and evenings spent reading or writing filled my days. The quiet confidence that had been shaken by betrayal returned stronger than before. I no longer questioned my judgment or my instincts. Each decision carried the certainty of experience and self-respect. Family gatherings became warm and intentional, bounded by respect and understanding. Damien and I shared laughter, conversation, and small moments that had once seemed impossible. The bond we had strengthened during the trial now flourished, built on honesty, vigilance, and shared trust. Together we reaffirmed what mattered: integrity, loyalty, and the freedom to live without fear of deceit. I also reflected on legacy, not just the material inheritance, but the values, resilience, and discernment passed on through action and example. My home, my friendships, and my relationships had been tested, and now they stood renewed, vibrant, and uncompromised. One evening, as the sun set over Miami, I locked a brass spare key in my desk drawer. Not for intrusion, only for respect, I whispered to myself. The gesture symbolized more than security. It was a testament to boundaries, clarity, and the life I had chosen to cultivate. I settled in my chair, breathing in the calm of a life reclaimed. The battles had ended, the lessons had been learned, and the future was open, rooted in courage, justice, and the unwavering strength of discernment.